Uno, dos, 1, 2, 3, 4.
You can have
Main event of the evening.
These days are
Hello and welcome to These Days Are Ours, a Happy Days podcast. I'm Peter.
And I'm Joe.
And today we will be discussing Season 5, Episode 8, Fonzie the Rock Entrepreneur, or Fonzie and Leather Tuscadero.
Okay, Peter, tell us what happens in Fonzie, the Rock Entrepreneur, or Fonzie and Leather Tuscadero.
We open at Arnold's, where Richie, Potsy, and Ralph are singing John Jacob Jingleheimer Schmidt.
His name is my name too. Boom.
When Joni runs in to ask if they remember Pinky Tuscadero. No, Fonzie's former fiancé hasn't returned. Her younger sister, Leather Tuscadero, has just got into town.
She seems really cool. She's about 18, she has brown hair. Oh, there she is now.
She enters, and Joni calls her over. Leather greets them with 2 slaps of her leg and a finger gun. She's looking for a job. She and some friends from school have formed a band, Leather and the Suades. Ralph suggests they play at Arnold's, but Richie claims he's joking. Arnold's already has a perfectly good band who really need the money. Leather thinks they can work something out, and Potsy suggests that their band plays backup for Leather's. Joni offers to doo-wop, but Leather says she can barely afford the backup singers she has.
What if I just do the dues for half price?
Said singers show up after Joni leaves. The boys are impressed that their names are Birdie and Gertie because everyone loves rhyming girls, I guess, and Richie offers to buy them a malt. Ralph goes to get his ventriloquist dummy to impress them, and Potsy expresses surprise.
I thought it was a kid with a hinged jaw and a top hat, but it looks so real.
That night at the Cunningham house, Fonzie and the Cunninghams are eating when Richie gets home. He tells them he met Leather at Arnold's, and Fonzie is furious, calling her worse than a bum and a thief.
A thief? Correctamundo.
3 years ago, she glommed his wallet, and even worse, his comb. Richie says Leather is very nice, and Fonzie asks if she told him she just got out of reform school. Richie says she seems sincere and is getting a rock group together, and Fonzie asks if the instruments were stolen. Richie says he heard a demo record, and Leather's band is quite good. Good enough that if Fonzie talked to Al, maybe he could get her band a gig at Arnold's. Fonzie laughs at him. Richie protests that Leather has learned her lesson and is trying for a fresh start. In the words of Alexander Pope, to err is human, to forgive divine. Fonzie storms off after complimenting Marion's dinner and quoting, "Punchy Pilot." He washes his hands of the whole thing. The next day at Arnold's, Leather strikes up a conversation with Fonzie.
He's so glad to see me.
They make awkward small talk, and Leather says she learned to sing so she doesn't have to steal anymore. This is who she is now. Fonzie doesn't seem to quite believe her. Leather, her band, and the guys get ready to audition as Ralph and Potsy crack sexist jokes.
3 girls, tight outfits. Great start.
Yeah, they might even be able to sing.
They play beautifully, and Al gives Leather and the Suades the gig. Fonzie acknowledges that Leather is good, but that doesn't mean she's gone straight. Al Capone was an accomplished harmonica player. Chachi runs in and asks if Al has hired the girls yet, because he's in trouble. Chachi heard through the grapevine that Officer Kirk is going to close Arnold's down if Al hires any ex-cons. Upon hearing this, both Leather and Al want to cancel.
Let's just forget the whole thing.
Yeah, that's a good idea. We should just forget it.
But Fonzie says that no one is throwing in the towel, and he'll handle the cops. The night of the Suades performance at Arnold's, Officer Kirk is there with...
All right, now hear this. There's a decadent rock and roll group working here tonight. We don't like undesirable people, do we?
Kirk leads the crowd in a chant of "Go home, jailbirds," while Leather refuses to go on stage. Fonzie goes inside the ladies' room to talk to her. Leather is mad that Fonzie didn't take care of Kirk, but Fonzie says it's time for Leather to stand up for her rights. Fonzie thought there was hope for Leather.
I wouldn't be standing here in the middle of a ladies' room talking to you if I didn't.
To err is human, to forgive divine. Leather still isn't ready, and she's not Fonzie. She can't control things with a snap of her fingers. Good luck is scarce for her. Fonzie says that's an excuse. He's been on his own since he was 6. He's never been in reform school because he wasn't stupid enough to steal. Leather has a choice to go out there or not. And if they won't give her a chance, she can win them over, like she won Fonzie over. Leather admits she's scared, and Fonzie says they all get scared. Birdie comes in to say Gertie quit. Joni volunteers to take her place. Birdie can teach her the moves, and Birdie says she's sticking with Leather, whatever she wants to do. Alone with Fonzie again, Leather worked up the courage to go outside and perform. Outside, Richie introduces Leather and the Suades, amidst the crowd's chants.
Ladies and gentlemen, now for the moment you've all been waiting for.
They perform all shook up, and the crowd is rendered silent. When they finish, it's to thunderous cheers and applause. Richie leads the crowd in a chant of "Go home, Kirk."
Go home, Kirk!
Go home, Kirk! Go home, Kirk! Go home, Kirk!
And the embarrassed cop leaves as Leather hugs Fonzie. Later, Fonzie has Chachi tell everyone everyone, he was talking to 2 booking agents from Chicago who were impressed by the Swades and wanted to send them on a cross-country tour, starting in San Francisco with Fabian. The girls are delighted, and Joni even deigns to hug Chachi once. The Swades prepare to go back on stage, and Richie tells Joni she's not going anywhere. She's a kid. Joni says if she's big enough to get the offer, she's big enough to go. And she's not asking their parents. She's telling them. She's going to San Francisco even if she has to run away. Then joins Leather and Birdie for a performance of Heartbreak Hotel.
Thank you, Peter. That was Fonzie and Leather Tuscadero Part 1, or Fonzie, Rock Entrepreneur Part 1, which first aired back on November 8th, 1977. That night, Happy Days served as the lead into a brand new Laverne and Shirley. That show was starting its own 2-parter, with the girls taking a cruise, only to find that Lenny and Squiggy have stowed away on the ship.
Hello.
CBS had a new episode of The Fitzpatricks, in which young Sean Fitzpatrick falls in love with an ice skater whose parents are involved in a bitter custody feud. And NBC had a new episode of Man from Atlantis, in which Mark's Atlantean instincts lead him to a remote western town called Land's End, where he meets his own twin. So, Peter, out of those 3, what are you watching?
Only one of those shows has Suzi Quatro, so...
I'm probably watching Happy Days and Laverne and Shirley as well, but I have to admit I'm intrigued by Man from Atlantis. Every episode of that show sounds like a fever dream. It sounds like somebody describing a dream to you when you read the plot summaries of those episodes. Fonzie and Leather Tuscadero Part 1 was directed by Jerry Paris and was written by Bob Runner, who was the showrunner on Happy Days at that time. The last of his episodes that we covered was Joni's weird boyfriend. As for guest stars, obviously our main one is Suzi Quatro as Leather Tuscadero, a pioneering singer-songwriter and bass player from Detroit. Suzi Quatro was a female rock star at a time when those were not at all common. Surprisingly, Suzi was always more successful overseas than in America. In England, for instance, she had 2 #1 songs, Can the Can, and Devilgate Drive. Here in America, her best-known song is Stumbling In, a duet with Chris Norman.
Our love is a lie, and so we begin, foolishly laying our hearts on the table, stumbling in.
Suzi has been cited as an influence by Joan Jett, Blondie, the Go-Go's, and more, and she was the subject of the 2019 documentary Suzi Q. So, Peter, what did you think of Suzi Quatro as Leather Tuscadero?
It's pretty obvious that Quatro isn't much of an actor.
When I was at school, I got together with a couple of friends of mine, and we formed a band.
But she's very good at projecting personality and presence, and she's really great in this episode.
I ended up liking Suzi Quatro as Leather Tuscadero quite a lot, even though, especially in the first scene, she is very tentative and stilted in her line readings. But I think she kind of loosens up as the 2-parter goes along. I think she really comes alive when it's time for Leather to perform on stage, and she gets 3 songs in this episode. And I think that's where you really see what Suzi Quatro can do. I also think it's kind of fascinating to see this very 70s person in 1959 Milwaukee, and everyone treats it as kind of normal that she's there. Their minds aren't completely blown by somebody from an obviously different time period just showing up at Arnold's.
Yeah, it's super weird. So my best guess is that Suzi Quatro somehow ended up 20 years in the past, and she decided, well, I'm here, I might as well start my career 20 years early. I don't know where her claiming to be Pinky's sister comes in, but if we theorize that Pinky is also a time traveler, maybe that's just Pinky's way of helping out a fellow time-displaced person.
They do not dig where that machine is going, but they sure hope to get back to 1957 Milwaukee.
Can you dig it?
Pinky obviously doesn't seem to belong to the 1950s either. We also have Ed Peck returning without really any explanation as Officer Kirk.
Come on, Officer Kirk. Can't we discuss this over an Arnold burger?
Making death threats, eh?
At the time of this episode, Ed had recently appeared on Laverne and Shirley. The last time we talked about him was in our review of AKA The Fonz. So what did you think of Ed Peck as Officer Kirk in this episode?
He was very scary, mildly amusing, but maybe hitting too close to home to really be funny. There was a time when I found Officer Kirk kind of delightful, which probably is a sign of my relative privilege that I can do that, but generally, he's a very genuinely terrifying person who is willing to leverage his power to basically do whatever he wants and take it out on anyone he deems undesirable. role, and that's scary. I did enjoy seeing Richie lead everyone in a chant of "Go home, Kirk," and him having to leave in embarrassment. That was great.
I think one of the more interesting things about Happy Days is that it has a recurring cop character who is an outright villain and has been that way since he debuted on the show. He's not sympathetic at all. He is always presented as the bad guy. He's presented as this bullying, petty, quasi-fascist guy. This is just more Kirk insanity, where he forces the crowd to chant "Go home, jailbird," and then they don't want to at the beginning.
Go home, jailbirds. Go home, jailbirds. Come on, let's hit it.
And he forces them to chant it until they're yelling it over and over again, which is a very threatening thing to do.
Can't you hear what that cop is doing out there? I'm not ready for that yet.
To me, this was a very interesting aspect of the episode, the way Officer Kirk is portrayed. And last but not least, of course, we have to have our Swades. We have Donna Fine as Birdie. She's the Swade who stays loyal. Donna was a singer. She was not an actress, so this was her only role. She also sang backup for Olivia Newton-John and Donna Summer. Plus, she crooned the title track from the 1980 movie Midnight Madness. So, Peter, what did you think, if anything, of Donna Fine as Birdie?
Do you think Birdie and Gertie are also time travelers, or are they native to the time period and Leather just recruited them to be her band?
I think they are native to the time period. That is why Birdie is so fascinated with Leather. She even says at one point,
I'm sticking with you. Whatever you want to do, I'm going with you.
She expresses her desire to do whatever Leather does. To me, that comes from the fact that Birdie has never seen or met anyone like Leather, obviously, so she is just fascinated, whereas the other Swade, Gertie, is frightened and runs away. Basically, to them, Leather Tuscadero might as well be an alien from outer space.
I really liked that little scene with Birdie telling Leather that whatever she's doing, she's sticking by her. I thought that was a very nice little bit of support, and I thought that that might have been a part of why Leather decided to go on stage and perform despite being afraid, because she knows she doesn't have to do it alone. If we assume that Leather is not a time traveler, she mentions that she met Birdie and Gertie also in school, which is to say reform school, so chances are that Birdie is included in Go Home Jailbirds, and she's going out there and she's performing anyway, and I think that's very brave.
That is admirable on her part. Last, we have Kathy Hilton, a.k.a. Kathy Richards as Gertie, the Swade who quits. A native New Yorker, Kathy is an actress and socialite who married into the Hilton family in 1979.
We're in the money, we're in the money. We've got a lot of what it takes to get along.
Her children include Paris Hilton and Nikki Hilton. As an actress, Kathy appeared in Bewitched, Family Affair, Rockford Files, and some other shows. More recently, though, she's been seen on numerous reality shows like Real Housewives of Beverly Hills, Life with LaToya, The Simple Life, and much more. Her half-sister is former child star Kim Richards. What did you think of Kathy Hilton as Gertie?
I did laugh when it turned out that she had made the same mistake as Potsy and assumed that Ralph's ventriloquist dummy was a kid.
Yeah, great. Can I sit next to the kid with the top hat?
That I thought was the most amusing aspect of her character. She was the other person convinced that the ventriloquist dummy was alive. But other than that, there's not really a lot to say about Kathy Hilton in this episode, although it's kind of weird to see Paris Hilton's mom on Happy Days.
Yeah.
As for songs this week, those rotten cheapskates at CBS Paramount took out all the jukebox music from my copy of the episode, but there were a few songs even they couldn't touch. The first was John Jacob Jingleheimer Schmidt, performed by Anson Williams, Donnie Most, and Ron Howard. This is a traditional American children's tune that seems to date back to vaudeville of the early 20th century. Usually the song's one verse is performed 4 times in a row, either getting faster or slower with each repetition.
Now what does that John Jacob Jingleheimer Schmidt do again?
He goes out, people shout. Not a whole lot more is known about him.
And then we have 3 songs by Suzi Quatro. Let's start with Cat Size.
I'm gonna find me a cat size.
This is a track from Suzi's 1974 sophomore album, Quatro. Suzi wrote this herself with her first husband, Len Tuckey. It's about her decision to leave Detroit. And then we get All Shook Up. Suzi actually included that track on her self-titled 1973 debut album. And finally, Heartbreak Hotel. Suzi included that song on her 4th album, 1976's Agrophobia. As for cultural and historical references this week, female rockers were rare in the 1970s and almost unheard of in the 1950s, so a character like Leather would have been a real oddity in 1959 Milwaukee. But there were some ladies in rock back then, including Janice Martin.
Everybody
Come on down, the man with the guitar just hit town.
And Wanda Jackson.
Some people like to rock, some people like to roll, but moving and a grooving's gonna satisfy my soul. Let's have a party.
Definitely check out their music if you haven't already. Fonzie uses the word glom.
3 years ago, she glommed my wallet.
Glom? Glom is early 20th century slang meaning steal. It comes from the Scottish word glaum. Had you heard that term, glom?
Yeah, here and there. Not in the context of stealing, though. I've heard it more as to glom onto, to kind of attach yourself to something.
You know, maybe she'd be a nicer person if she had a family of her own. You know, instead of always having to glom on to someone else's. You know.
That's what I'd always heard. I'd always heard it as glomming on to something else that somebody has, and I never heard it as stealing, but that's apparently what it meant. This is the second time that Happy Days has used the phrase to err is human, to forgive divine. The first time was The Motorcycle, where it was incorrectly attributed to Shakespeare. This time they correctly credit Alexander Pope, who used it in an essay on criticism from 1711.
To err is human, to forgive divine.
In an episode filled with bizarre moments, to me there was none stranger than Fonzie empathizing with Pontius Pilate, whom he calls Punchy Pilate.
Well, I'm saying what Punchy Pilate said. I washed my hands of the whole thing.
Pilate served as the 5th Roman governor of Judea from about 26 AD to 36 AD. He is said to have presided over the trial of Jesus Christ. That story about him washing his hands comes from the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 27, verse 24.
I was around when Jesus Christ had his moment of doubt and pain. Me damn sure the Pilate washed his hands and sealed his face.
What did you think about Fonzie quoting Pontius Pilate?
Well, I thought it was an interesting twist on all the times before that you've compared him to Jesus.
It kind of undermines my theory if he empathizes with Pontius Pilate, if he sees himself as the Pontius Pilate of this story.
Maybe at the end, when he realizes that Leather really is trying to change and he should help her out, maybe he has a change of heart regarding Pontius Pilate.
That's possibly true. Fonzie has his facts just slightly wrong.
I heard Al Capone was an accomplished harmonica player.
Al Capone did play in the prison band while in Alcatraz, but his instrument was banjo.
Oh, that is delightful.
Isn't that great? That was one of the things that you never find out about unless you host a Happy Days podcast and look into it.
That makes me so happy.
Outside the women's restroom is a poster advertising a Shakespeare festival held in Stratford-on-Avon from July 19th to the 29th, 1967. The plays presented were Julius Caesar, Hamlet, King Lear, Othello, and Twelfth Night.
So much time travel in this episode.
That poster really stuck out because it's got kind of a groovy late 60s aesthetic to it, and I had to find out what that was. Fabiano Forte, known professionally as Fabian, was a major teen singing idol of the late 1950s and early 1960s.
Turn me loose, I say.
As a teen in Philadelphia, he was discovered for his looks, not his musical talent. He was one of the first manufactured idols in rock history, and he said that he felt like a puppet at the time. Fabian also guested on Laverne and Shirley just a few weeks later.
Girls, that wasn't very smart.
But I don't think mentions Leather Tuscadero. So other observations. There is a lot of speculation about Leather's name, with Ralph believing it's something dirty in part 1.
Leather?
And Marion thinking the same thing in part 2.
Oh, leather. I get it. You wear leather outfits.
Well, why else do you think they would call her Leather, sweetheart?
I was afraid to ask.
Is this a joke about leather fetishism?
Maybe? I mean, Fonzie wears a lot of leather, too.
But he doesn't wear head-to-toe leather. He doesn't wear the jacket and the pants.
Yeah, very true.
And both Ralph and Marion seem to think that there's something up with a young woman calling herself Leather, and I was like, what's going on here? The University of Wisconsin banners are back up at Arnold's, and the Jefferson High stuff is mostly gone. So I guess that the apartment was an anomaly. You speculated that the apartment was probably being shown out of sequence. I think this is some more evidence of that. Bertie and Gertie are the second set of rhyming girls this season following Maisie and Daisy last week. What an odd running joke. I did not expect that to become a runner, but it did.
Yeah, real odd.
The stuff about the ventriloquist dummy is also very bizarre. I don't know what was weirder, the fact that we never actually see the dummy or the fact that Potsy thinks it's alive.
I loved that joke. Both times it came up, A+.
That was one of my favorite things in the episode, but it's so odd that we never even see the dummy. The Amundos of the week are Fabamundo and Correctamundo. And I have to comment on this. Those cutaways to Joni during the dinner scene are obviously shot separately. Erin Moran looks like she's in another dimension.
Help me, I'm in another dimension! Help me, I'm still here, I can't get out!
The way the Happy Days set is laid out, obviously the fourth wall is missing so that we can see into their living room. And the fourth wall is the one that would be behind Joni's chair. So if they want to do a shot of Joni sitting at the dinner table, there has to be a wall behind her, and that all has to be filmed separately with Joni nodding and smiling at nobody. Do you notice those shots, or do you even know the shots that I'm talking about?
Yeah, and they're real weird.
There's a lot of location footage at the Cunningham house this week. We see Richie pull into the driveway, and we see Fonzie ride out of it, or rather Fonzie's stuntman. We don't get much of an update on Pinky, do we? Just that she's cool. You'd think that we'd get a little bit more information about what's happening with Pinky. It's almost like no one wants to talk about her. What's going on there, you think?
I don't know. Maybe they just don't want to talk about her. For me, the weirdest part of the episode was when Richie asked Fonzie, hey, remember Pinky Tuscadero? You know, the girl you almost married? And it's like, yeah, he probably does remember her, Richie. They almost got married.
Obviously, Fonzie almost married Pinky. Breaking up with her was a really heartbreaking thing for him. A season later, it's like, hey, you remember Pinky Tuscadero? Yeah, he remembers. They were almost married. So that was very odd to me. And I'm pretty sure this is the first scene we have ever had in the ladies' room at Arnold's.
I think so.
And I'd like to think that the crew had a fun time writing all that graffiti, most of which is about Fonz. Or I think all of it is actually about Fonz.
Yeah, there's the one that's an acrostic of Fonzie's name.
There's one that says, live dangerously, date the Fonz. And then there's all kinds of weird, wonderful graffiti in the back. There's a beetle-looking guy drawn on the back wall. There's all kinds of weird messages, including one that says, Amy loves the Fonz. I want to think that that was Amy Bosley, Tom Bosley's daughter, who maybe got to write that. I would just like to think that the cast and crew was just invited to come into the set and write all over the walls, as long as it's about Fonzie.
American graffiti.
So, Peter, were there any outstanding Happy Days fashions this week?
I really liked the outfit that Leather was wearing at the beginning. Full leather head-to-toe look. It's very anachronistic, probably not super practical for everyday wear, but it looked really nice, and I did really like the purple scarf she was wearing that pulled it all together. That was really neat. And I also liked the kind of Elvis-y look she was wearing when she was performing with the Suedes near the end.
Suzi Quatro was a huge Elvis fan, so much so that her onstage look was inspired by the leather jumpsuit Elvis had worn for his comeback performance.
It's a really neat look. She's very good at being a rock star.
She is. Over in England, she was actually considered part of the glam rock scene, and you can really tell that in her hair and her clothing and her stage presence. And it's, as you say, very anachronistic, but still nevertheless very cool to have in a show like this. So, Peter, I will ask that age-old timeless question. Was this episode any good?
Yes, it was. I really liked Richie initially being passive-aggressive about how, no, Arnold's couldn't hire another band because he's already got a band. And then later on, he's like completely supportive of Leather, and he's trying to get Fonzie to help her out. Then at the end, when he leads the Go Home Kirk chant, that was great. And this is also a great episode for Fonzie being melodramatic and a little bit self-righteous, and then doing a 180 and also doing his best to help Leather by giving her a pep talk that is half hectoring her. But hey, it works, so that's neat. And we got to hear Suzi Quatro perform a few times, and she's very good.
I think the main reason to watch an episode like this is to see Suzi Quatro in her 1970s prime, and she performs 3 songs in the episode, which I think is great. Plot-wise, this episode is kind of all over the place. Like when it ends up being a story about Joni at the end, or they're setting up a story about Joni, that's barely telegraphed at all. The plot is kind of all over the place. Is this a story about Fonzie forgiving Leather? Is this a story about Leather having the courage to go back up on stage? And then it ends up being a story about Joni at the end. I don't even think they know what kind of story that they wanted to tell with this setup. But still in all, there's so much fun stuff in this episode that I couldn't possibly dislike it. I actually enjoyed this quite a bit. And just seeing Suzi Quatro on Happy Days was so cool that I kind of forgave the ridiculousness of the story and just kind of went along with it. I enjoyed this episode an awful lot, and I would very much recommend it to people. So, Peter, tell the people where they can keep up with us and find out about all the wonderful things that we are doing.
Listeners can follow us on Twitter at Fonzie Podcast. They can follow me on Twitter at Vulfranx. That's VULFRANX.
And they can follow me on Twitter at Joe_A_Blevins. They can find this podcast online at thesedaysareours.libsyn.com. And they can email us with questions, comments, and concerns at thesedaysareourspodcast@gmail.com. So, Peter, what do we have on the docket for next week?
Next week, it's Fonzie the Rock Entrepreneur Part 2, or Fonzie and Leather Tuscadero Part 2.
It's not over yet.
Where Joni's plans to go to San Francisco go a little bit awry.
That sounds very intriguing. So, see you later, alligator.
In a while, crocodile.
speaks to the kid with the top hat?